do you think there is that kind of dismissal of school anxiety, but this relentless push towards attendance?
I think there's a tendency, again in my experience, there was a tendency not to believe it was real.
It's convenient to them to not believe it's real because then they don't have to do anything. But also, like what you're saying, it's like they don't see it.
Welcome to the Missing Register webinar series. This series seeks to understand the causes of school distress and anxiety and what needs to change to reduce it by bringing together lived experience, professional insight and research. Today's guests include Daniel and Karen and Dr. Joe Billington. Daniel and Karen bring valuable expertise into the education system through their lived experience of navigating it together. Jo is a lecturer and a researcher at the University of Reading, where she co-leads the Centre for Autism Wellbeing Hub. Her work focuses particularly on autistic children's lived experience in mainstream schools. You can read more about their experience and expertise in the description of this video. We filmed our conversations separately and I have edited them together. The questions were co-constructed by a panel of neurodivergent children who also made some drawings that might be shown throughout the webinar. Today's first question asks, how and why can school cause distress among children and young people? And there are 6 questions within that in total, which I have split into 2 videos. The questions answered in this video are, what parts of school can be particularly distressing and why? Why does school distress arise more frequently among neurodivergent children? And how does school distress tend to show up in school and at home? This is the first webinar in a series of about 6. The next one, which will be out sometime next month, will answer what is the parental experience of school distress. I would like to thank the Newcastle University's Tilly Hale Award for funding this webinar series, as well as the working group and the advisory panel, and our wonderful guests who shared their insights and experiences. Thank you so much for your support, and let's get started with the first question. So as we were talking about before, the conversation today is about how and why can school cause distress among children and young people. And we have these questions that I've sent you through. And the first one is, what parts of school can be particularly distressing for children and why?
So the immediate thing that I kind of latched onto, both because of like the image, but also just in general, is overstimulation. Because I think whether you're neurodivergent or not, school is a very overstimulating environment. It's noise, it's things constantly happening, it's things moving around and changing, and often quite lacking in clarity.
Also, I think there's a lot of demands made on children, often from the teachers, who obviously they're not going to explain every single detail of why they're asking something to the students probably, but I think especially for autistic children it can be very confusing why you're being asked to do something if it's not clearly explained, which I think can lead to distress and anxiety.
And it's a situation you don't have an out from. Obviously once you're out of school, in most cases for the day, you can't leave. But even beyond that, you can't leave the situation. If you're in a class, you might be allowed to get up and go to the loo, but other than that, it's like, you're not leaving that room. You're not leaving the situation until it's over. Mm-hmm. So, you don't even really have an escape from it. Like, it's noise and stimulation, it's going, and you don't have an out, which is probably the most distressing element of that, is that you can't even get away from it.
I think I'm going to stick with neurodivergent children, or specifically autistic children, just because that's my kind of area of expertise. But I think the parts of school that can be particularly distressing for neurodivergent children really come down to this goodness of fit between kind of neurodivergent ways of being and the environmental circumstances that person finds themselves in. So, one of the key things that I remind, when I work with teachers, I remind them of this, that the average primary school in England has between 700 and 800 pupils, and the average secondary school has double that number. we're talking about mainstream settings here. And that's just the pupils. That's not staff, visitors, additional people in the space. And so just even thinking about that sheer volume of bodies and, the noise that can make, the smell of that many bodies, and when we're thinking about a particular group of people who may have, very high levels of perception when it comes to sensory stimuli, that in and of itself can be incredibly distressing. When I talk to autistic adults and I ask them about their lives and I ask them about where they feel most comfortable, and the jobs they've chosen for themselves and the life kind of circumstances that they've chosen for themselves in adulthood, it's often, far away from crowded spaces. And for most of us, unless you, I don't know, work, for example, in an airport or a hospital or live in a big city, most of us don't find ourselves rubbing along with potentially 1,000 other people on a daily basis. So just that on its own can be incredibly stressful, incredibly distressing.
And I think from our situation, the schedule in school changing without warning. If you go into school in the morning and you think you're having maths and this is a completely different timetable, which schools often did to make things more fun sometimes, but I think for Daniel, going in and being surprised caused huge amounts of anxiety.
I mean, it can be as simple as just, there's a special day on you didn't hear about, so that's just, it's different, it's unexpected, you're not prepared for it.
And we also have to think about the fact that schools are very unpredictable places. So things can change, things can move, things can shift. And sometimes things that could be made predictable are just not made predictable for whatever reason. So for example, I'm thinking of a child who I was talking to recently who really loved trampolining, really, really loved it. And they had that, I don't know, on a Wednesday afternoon. But this particular Wednesday afternoon, trampolining was cancelled because they were doing SATs in the hall where trampolining normally takes place. And this was incredibly distressing for this autistic child. And my immediate thought was, I'm guessing that wasn't a decision that was taken at the last minute. I'm guessing there was some time involved in that. For a start, SATs would have been planned way, 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 way in advance. Also, the person who runs the trampolining, all of the equipment that's needed, so all of that would have been organised some time before. But this child found out maybe half an hour before. So there's unpredictability that's unavoidable, but then there's also unpredictability that is avoidable, but is somehow still just within the fabric of most school cultures. That's really, really hard for autistic and otherwise neurodivergent children who, in order to thrive and in order to flourish, require a predictable environment. And when I say that that's neurodivergent children who need that, I would go as far as to say that's a human requirement. We all thrive and flourish when we know what to expect.
And the trick is that, as you say, they don't explain themselves in these situations, because at home there's a degree to which a parent earns respect. You come to respect them because they earn it. They tell you why they're doing things, and if they don't, that's not great. Teachers don't do that. They expect to be respected. They're in a position of authority. It's their classroom. You're there to learn. Shut up. So quite often they aren't clear about why they're saying or changing things or why they're doing certain things, so you don't get that, it creates even more distress, because more than anything it's things are happening, you don't know why, you don't have a way out, and the person who could tell you is not explaining.
And it sort of links with the drawing, of
yeah,
that kind of relentless demands and overstimulation, but also it's quite authoritative of the teacher in it as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, they are in the situation an authoritarian. It's their situation. They are in charge. If you don't listen, you're in trouble.
Within the physical environment of the school as well, parts of it, for example, the dinner hall can be quite a stressful place to be because it tends to be chaotic and noisy. But also, again, from our experience, I think break times, those kind of unstructured parts of the day can equally lead to anxiety, especially if perhaps a child's struggling at school and maybe doesn't have the sort of the security of a group of friends to necessarily spend time with at break times. I mean, that led to a lot of anxiety because you go out into this space and you don't know what to do.
And then you've got the social expectations, because schools are not just kind of places of learning. They're also places of what might be called cultural transmission. So when you talk to educators, there's definitely, obviously, a real priority to pass on learning, to facilitate learning of the national curriculum. But there's also this other stuff about creating good citizens. That's very much the business of schools. And of course, quite a lot of that concept of what is a good citizen is related to quite neuronormative ideas, particularly in childhood. So our behaviour as citizens, I would argue, is nowhere more heavily policed than in childhood. Everyone has an opinion on how children should be, how they should behave, and also maybe related to kind of British culture, perhaps. We have a very high priority given to things like politeness and so on, which again is really neuronormative. So those social expectations of children as well can be really baffling because they're not always taught in a way that other things are taught. Often these social expectations are taught through when you get things wrong. And what you're taught is that you've got something wrong. You're not taught what you got wrong and how you might fix it, but you're effectively kind of punished for when you might break some of those social expectation rules. Also, those expectation rules are really heavily mapped onto age. We even have some kind of cliches, don't we, where, act your age, or you're 10 now, you shouldn't be doing that, or you're 14 now, you shouldn't be doing that, etc., etc. And so we have these, again, very heavily policed social expectations that are quite opaque and might differ from whoever's policing them. So one teacher might have a different set of values to another. One person who's in power might have a different version of expectations than someone else that's in power. This makes it very, very difficult, for anyone really to kind of get a true sense of how they should be. But that can be incredibly baffling if your innate internal kind of social compass is very different to those around you.
Kind of leads to the second question, and obviously we can draw on the first one and things you've got noted down for that, but why does schooling distress arise more frequently among neurodivergent children?
So it does feed back into what we said, because I think school is overstimulating no matter who you are, and the neurodivergent are prone to overstimulation, I think is how I'd put it. If you've got sensory issues, you can't handle loud noises, you can't handle lots of voices talking. It's like there's conversations happening all around you. And then you're in the position of a lot of neurodivergent people, which is struggling to communicate, either because you just don't know how, or you literally can't, because some people struggle with communication, or you just don't have the nerve for whatever reason to go up and talk to someone, or you don't trust them, relevantly, from experience, because people have communication difficulties, so you can't even deal with it.
So I think that's how it often escalates to the stage where it becomes a real problem, and you're at the point of having to take a child out of school, or look at different types of schooling, because we found that the distress, the anxiety built and built and built over many instances like the one Daniel's just described, and nobody recognised, I think, what was happening until it was at a point where we didn't know how to deal with it. And I've, just talking to other parents, there often seems to come a point where there's, the child acts completely out of character and either lashes out or runs away or takes some kind of drastic step because the distress has just got to such a point that they don't know what else to do.
I mean, I think the thing is that we need to be really cautious and say that, to avoid implying that to be neurodivergent, that somehow neurodivergence causes the distress. I think that's something that we need to be really clear about, and that actually what is now becoming, even more clear through, repeated research studies, is that it really is this mismatch, this poorness of fit between the individual and their environment. And in relation to autonomy, lots of things that neurodivergent people might need in order to cope with a poorness of fit between them and their environment is again heavily policed, possibly related to those social expectations. So a child who may need to move, who may need to actually physically move their body in order to regulate themselves in some way, in order to be able to really focus on what they're doing, to give it their full attention, they may need to move. That movement might not be permitted in the classroom. A child who's feeling overwhelmed, who might need quiet because of the crowds and the noise and so forth, who might need to leave the room and find a quiet space, that quiet space may not exist in their school. That's what I hear from a lot of my participants. There is nowhere quiet for them to go. Or if there is, there's a whole range of different kind of barriers that they need to experience in order to access that space. So, for example, they might have been given a permit, a card perhaps, or an indicator that enables them to leave the class early or to leave the class in the middle of a lesson in order to go and regulate somewhere. But in order to do that, they need to make themselves highly visible, and that could be excruciating. Or when they get to that space where it's quiet, the one child I was speaking to recently said, well, I can go to the quiet space, but they don't close the door and everyone walks past and everyone can see me there. So again, feeling like they're in a goldfish bowl, feeling that level of scrutiny. So, it's better that I just sit and I just suck it up because actually, although I might be given some adjustments, the barriers to benefiting from those adjustments are in and of themselves harmful. There are so many different levels here, and I think that's what we need to think about when we think about school distress in neurodivergent children. For many of them, it isn't a big dramatic event that happens. Sometimes it is, and I don't want to minimise anyone's experience if that's happened to them. But for the most part, what I hear is it's what an autistic activist called Alexis Quinn describes as death by a million paper cuts. It's kind of like this persistent, regular, daily adversity that to people on the outside may seem insignificant or trivial. And indeed, in those individual circumstances, they could easily be trivialised, they could easily be minimised, but it's the sheer volume of challenge, and it's often a simultaneous challenge that's happening all at the same time, whilst also having all the other things that all kids have, like, the pressures of academic performance, the ins and outs of social relationships, the impact of puberty, all of that stuff that happens to all of us, regardless of our neurotype. So I think that's the thing that we need to be really conscious of, is that it's not necessarily that this big drama happens. It's that it's this very subtle, almost kind of like grains of sand that accumulate into this huge mountain of challenge.
It's exacerbated by the fact that there are systematic problems that make it worse, because there's the element of neurodivergence, which is, the kid has the problem, which is your stress, your anxiety, your sensory issues. But there's also, the school doesn't get it. Like, quite often they're not trained for it, they don't have the budget for it, so they just don't know. They don't understand what the problem is. Again, the reason that I got thrown out of the class that day isn't because the teacher was, like, maliciously targeting me. They just didn't get it. This kid said something that was incredibly insensitive. They don't understand that I don't understand in that situation. And also, the school system is just designed in such a rigid way that it's one size fits all. So if you don't, you're out of the classroom. That's the trick with neurodivergence, is that half the problem is the problems it causes, and the other half is the problems other people cause by not getting it. Either because they don't want to or they've never been taught to.
So many times over the years, teachers have said to me, oh, it used to be so much better in the past. You know, there were different kinds of schools. There was more choice. And that successive governments have tried to make schools the only place that, the only option you have, so that if you don't fit into that system, if you can't adapt and get the best out of it, like most children are able to do, there's nowhere else to go.
Screw you, effectively. Too bad.
I think that links quite nicely into the next question, which is, how does school distress tend to show up in school and conversely at home?
In my experience, both of my own experience and talking to people, school isn't where it shows up. When you freak out, it's not there. It's at home. Of course it is. Because when you're at school, it's like your friends are there, hopefully, or like the staff are there who will get in trouble. You'll get in trouble with if you freak out. So you don't freak out there. You freak out at home, and it shows up like, yeah, you're hiding under things, you're crying, you're screaming, you're doing anything you can to not go there or to make it delay as long as possible. But then the problem is that school is then the situation of, well, we're not seeing it, so you're probably just making it up.
I think a lot of children, certainly Daniel, are really, really good at masking what's going on. So they, right through primary school, for example, we were told that Daniel didn't need any help because he was coping, but he was only coping within those few hours he was at school, and even there I would challenge whether he actually was. But at home it became a battlefield. Every morning was the same. We never quite knew whether we would get him out of the bedroom, out of the house, into the car. He was, as he said, he would hide. He was physically ill a lot, and so we, often we'd end up having to phone school and say that he wasn't coming in because he actually was. He'd made himself so ill that he couldn't physically leave the house, and that made things worse, because one thing schools, in my experience, do get involved with is when you're absent. They really don't like that. So we get to the point where we were getting the meetings we had been asking for, but all they wanted to talk about was why you weren't in school. They didn't want to talk about the reasons. They would look at if an incident happened last week, they'd deal with that, but there was never real appreciation of the depth of the problem, or just how much it was affecting all of us.
Because at school, what it shows up in my experience, is you don't talk to people, you panic, but it's, restrained. You don't trust them in the slightest, because they've shown no reason for you to. Like, they're the people who are causing the problem. Why would you trust them? So, it doesn't come out there. And when it comes out there, when a kid has that freak out and hits someone, or screams in a class, or runs out, and there's someone we know who has climbed a fence and walked to the coast because they just had enough. When it gets to that point, it's because it's exploded. That didn't happen that day. It happened that year, that month. It's it shows up at home, and by the time it shows up at school, it's too late.
I mean, one of the kind of things that I'm really mindful of is that there tends to be a kind of binary discourse in this. You know, the child who has a very visible presentation of distress is somebody who may have a meltdown or display what some people might define as challenging behaviour. And then on the other side, we have somebody who's very withdrawn, who, you know, we hear a lot of particularly autistic children who try as much as possible to be invisible in their school settings. And I think that's an important thing to think about, is that some of the children who are most distressed are the children that nobody really identifies or notices as being distressed. So, you know, those are the kind of the two kind of extreme kind of binary presentations that I think most people who are involved in this conversation might recognise. But I think also we can see distress in forms of things like perfectionism. You know, I in my own research with children aged 9 and 10, so years 5 and 6 of primary school, this comes up a lot. You know, the wanting to be a good kid, you know, that's you know, the need to be kind of approved of, particularly by the class teacher, because this class teacher is a key figure of safety in a space that may feel chaotic and may feel threatening, but in ways that aren't easily understood when you're 9 years old. You just know this all feels too much, but you don't know why and you don't know how, and there's this person who can make it all better, you know, and frequently does. You know, this is in one of my studies, you know, with children who describe themselves as enjoying school. The class teacher was the key kind of arbiter of whether that was an enjoyable year or not. And so this perfectionism, the mortification that comes with any indication of teacher disapproval, you know, that is a key indicator of distress. Of course, compliance as well. I think they're connected a little bit, the perfectionism and the compliance. You know, wanting to not step a foot wrong, not wanting to again, just the fear of disapproval. But then also, you know, when we think about the impact of that, you know, the sheer volume of energy, mental and physical energy, it's incredibly expensive to live 6 hours of every day in that kind of, you know, pressure cooker of emotional constraint. What we often find is that for many of these children, when they get home, that's when they kind of fall apart, really, because that's their safe place. That's where they know that they can dysregulate and they're with safe people. And so what we often hear of are stories where, you know, families will know that this child is in extreme distress. You know, coming home from school is an issue, getting ready for school in the morning is an issue, Sunday afternoon, evenings, you know, becoming incredibly tense with the, you know, the thinking about the Monday morning. And then when parents report this to schools are saying, but there's no problem. There's no problem at all. This is an ideal child, you know, because of that perfectionism, because of the compliance, because of the, you know, I want to be a good kid. You know, that's a very, very common set of circumstances. And the challenge then is that, you know, a number of things happen. So I'm not suggesting this happens in all situations, but there is some really compelling evidence around this about, you know, kind of the scrutiny that then falls onto families. But there's nothing happening at school, so it must be something in the home, must be something going on. And that then creates kind of tension within families. It makes, you know, it really damages the home-school relationship, because parents feel under pressure, they feel blamed in some way. At the very least, they don't feel heard or validated when they share their concerns with school staff. But certainly from the position of school staff, you know, that by all accounts, this looks like a child who's doing really well. So it's very difficult for some school staff to even comprehend that this child is really, really in deep distress, because what that distress looks like isn't how they imagine distress in their own mind.
There was definitely a tendency to blame Daniel's parents for not making him go to school. Like I was endlessly told stories of better parents who brought their children in naked. One instance I was told about, many times in pyjamas, and these were held up as examples of what you should be doing, because all that matters is that child gets to school, which obviously wasn't something we were prepared to do. But I always imagined it's they have to deal with absence because it's something that the government care about, and they are held up to standards for attendance that...
I mean, outside of the metric of like giving them credit, which is they don't see it, so it's hard for them to know it's real, there is also the cynical, possibly more honest to our experience thing, which is they don't want to know. They would rather it not be real, because they get nothing out of having to support you, but they need you to be there because you're on their rota. If you're not there, it looks bad on them, because then people start asking them questions. So they don't care. Like, it does not benefit them in the slightest to do anything beyond what they need to get you to enter the building.
I mean, to the extent that we had a school that were happy to let Daniel sleep in a sensory room, but that didn't matter because he was in the building, so that's all that mattered.
Same place was like, oh yeah, just don't show up, just stay on the thing, and we'll just say you're coming in. Effectively,
for us, it came down to having to separate school from getting an education, because we couldn't make the two go together.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering kind of how that is within the safeguarding approaches, and I'm wondering whether their desire to have children in school is kind of rooted in a belief that they're safer.
Possibly, yeah.
It's difficult because like the two experiences we've had range so wildly in terms of what it felt like their motives were, because the mainstream school that we dealt with this with did feel like that was more their motive, was that they thought they could help, and that like they didn't have the tools but were trying to a degree, whereas the special school we went to really did feel like it was the metrics and they weren't interested. Like, they had a way of doing things, and if you didn't fit that way, they no longer cared. Like, it wasn't their problem. So it's difficult, because I agree, I'm sure that the it's safer thing is part of it, but when the people we've dealt with have been so flagrantly just right up to the line of admitting they're just trying to keep their numbers together, it's hard to give them that credit.
I mean, I have to say, over the years, we have met and had to deal with some amazing teachers who really have tried to help, and all felt that their hands were tied by the system, really. There's only so much they could do.
Often what then happens is, well, they didn't say anything. The people didn't say anything. So why wouldn't they have said anything? And that, again, is an additional pressure then. Because, I have autistic children, and I know it's really, really hard for them to explain their emotional experiences. It takes time to kind of figure that all out. And, when you're 9 years old, or, even when you're, 90 years old, that might be really hard to do that. And often the time isn't given, and the psychological safety, or the perception of psychological safety, isn't necessarily in place for some children to be able to kind of really work through, because a lot of these things, a lot of these distresses and challenges, particularly in the younger children that I talk to, is absolutely felt. It's really real. The feeling is there, but the language around that feeling and the knowledge of oneself in order to make sense of those feelings isn't there. And that in itself is very distressing. So feeling things that you can't understand and that you can't adequately describe, and that you're required to articulate in words, which for many, many autistic people is not the preference when it comes to communication. Even if you're, hyperverbal, it may still not be your preference to talk about emotional things using mouth words. You may prefer some other form of communication instead. But it might be that that facility for that is not there, and you might not have ever been encouraged to or supported to communicate how you feel in ways that don't involve words. It kind of puts that responsibility back onto the child to say, tell me about what, and this all comes from a place of wanting the absolute best for this child. This isn't, from people who have anything other than the very best of intentions. But that neuronormativity is still kind of forming the barrier, because if I need help, I've got to ask for it. And if I've got to ask for it, I can't do that. So I'm going to just keep struggling.
And often in research, when you do ask for it, the dismissal can happen anyway because of kind of childism, still the neuronormative within that of kind of, oh bless them, they're just often not saying it. So for example, saying it in a very matter-of-fact way of, I'm really struggling, and being very kind of clear, and that being like, well, you don't seem that distressed. But I think what's really interesting about your research and what we were speaking about with Daniel and Karen yesterday is that often the processing, you get really unique insights from adults, from autistic and neurodivergent adults, because as a child, the way Daniel described it is sort of, you're in the trenches, so you can't see what's around you. You don't know why, you don't know that the distress is because the lights are too bright. You just know that you're feeling dysregulated, and it's not until you're an adult that you can then reflect.
Absolutely, and that's something that's come out in my research frequently, is that it takes time away from the school system to be able to look back on it and be able to really kind of connect with what that experience meant. And I think that's the other thing that I think is worth mentioning in relation to school distress, is that there's no space. So you've got to get back up and you've got to do it again tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. The autistic adults that I work with in my research and in my practice, many of them work part-time, so that there's some space in between the work that they do in order for them to kind of rest, still their kind of resource toolkit again, recharge their batteries, whatever metaphor works. And that's really, really important. And many of them have come to part-time working, not necessarily because they knew themselves really well in the beginning, but because they went from school to college to uni to work and completely burnt out. And it's through that crisis that they've then kind of understood that, there needs to be a different way. There has to be a different way of doing life. I know I'm thinking of one particular collaborator I work with, and she has just silent days. Her family understand, her friends understand, her managers understand, that she will have days where she is just not going to speak because it's just really, really draining for her, and she just needs rest. And of course, that understanding is just not there in childhood for that to happen. Just being present is so prioritized over anything else, that in itself means that when children, the potential release valve to be able to cope with an environment that isn't really designed for you, that release valve is not there. And the pressure on children and families, if you do need to take that time, is so great, and the disincentives around it are so serious, that it's just not there. And like you say, it's kind of, we're all the while dealing with people's attitudes as well. you just need to be more resilient, you just need to be a bit more this or a bit less that. And often neurodivergent children and their families report kind of feeling both simultaneously too much but also not enough. It's kind of it's really hard to kind of communicate these needs and requirements when there is widespread misunderstanding and a lack of acceptance of those needs.
Thank you so much for listening. For part 2, where we talk about the common misunderstandings of school distress, how attempts to help can inadvertently worsen it, and what needs to change to make educational environments where young people can genuinely thrive, please click the link in the description below.